Hi everybody, my name's Nick Stewart, and today I'm going to be ranking every single sci-fi fantasy book I have ever read. So I'm excited to get started, and I'm going to go ahead and jump right in. Starting with the Chronicles of Narnia. I was a huge reader of the books, and then me and my family also watched the original movies. Not the remakes, but the original ones. And we really enjoyed them, but if I'm going to be judging these books off of character, prose, world building, etc., I don't know if I can remember enough about this to accurately make a decision. So I'm going to have to put it in the I can't remember enough about it to say if it's an S, an A, a B, or a C, or a D, which means I probably need to reread it. All right, the next book series on my list is the Darth Bane trilogy, and I don't know if this is sci-fi or fantasy. I always thought of it as sci-fi, but I read something recently where it having the Force, it being magic, essentially makes it fantasy. And I agree with that. Star Wars is essentially space wizards trying to bring safety and order to the galaxy. So I don't know if it's sci-fi or fantasy. I'm going to do more research on the difference between the two. But all in all, the Darth Bane trilogy was a really well-written book series. The characters were awesome. The plot was awesome. And it brought a lot to the Star Wars story. So I'm putting that in the A category for sure. This next series, I'm actually going to start with the Sword of Truth series because it came before the Nikki Chronicles. And I know Terry Goodkind is a controversial figure and that his books are also controversial. I know people are hesitant to speak about his books or him as a person too now that he's passed. I don't feel that same hesitancy because I'm going to try to be objective about his works. Me and his works have a love-hate relationship, and even though I've heard things that make me maybe like this series a little bit less, it was still a huge part of my journey through fantasy. It was my first series into the adult fantasy world, I would say, and the first 6 books are still something that I can sit down and read over and over again. I've probably read the first 6 books 6 times. So like the first 6 books I would throw in the A category. After that though, it seems like the series completely changes. I don't hear the characters' voices anymore. I hear Terry Goodkind's. I think that what could have been told in 2 books ends up being told in 6 books. And then they add a small series onto the end of this book, which essentially throws a whole new magic system and history to the book, which Terry Goodkind probably should have just made into a whole separate series instead of adding it on to the Sword of Truth series. So I don't understand. I think that the first 6 belong up here, but all in all, as a series together, if I'm judging this fairly, it's got to go in the C category. Obviously, as you can tell by my lack of variety, I like to reread book series. Like I said, I've read the first 6 books probably 6 times, but I also like to finish book series to completion. And because of that, I feel like I can't enjoy the Sword of Truth series as much as I used to, because I do want to read it from the first book to the last book. And the end there is just so unenjoyable, it makes it hard for me to get past. So in conclusion, the first 6 are probably A, but after that, it almost gets to the point where they're not worth reading. So I'll keep it as a C. Which leads us to the Nikki Chronicles. The Nikki Chronicles is a book series that also shouldn't have been Nikki in the books. He should have started a new fantasy series in a new fantasy world and tried to write something like that. At this point, his writing's really gone downhill. And honestly, I should have put an F in here because there's very few series I would say the story was not worth telling. This shouldn't be nobody should start this book series, and I think this was one of them. That is my personal opinion. I'm sure there's people out there that love the Nikki Chronicles. I'm not one of those people, and I thought Terry Goodkind was using the hype of his Sword of Truth series to sell more books. That's my opinion. I'm sticking with it. On to our next series. This is the Unhewn Throne trilogy by Brian Staveley. I I actually listened to these books on Audible when I was a mailman for the US Postal Service. Really cool world, really cool characters, but the writing just wasn't on par. The development of the characters was kind of weird. The plot didn't really make sense to me. So, all in all, I'm going to have to put it as a C. The next series on my list is The Inheritance Cycle. I know people are split on it. I know that he has a lot of influences from other books. I've heard that Dragon Riders of Pern is a major influence in this book, which I have never read. But all in all, I enjoyed it. I didn't like the ending. I felt like he wanted to get out of the world, so he rushed it. What should have been 2 books was actually 1 book. And I feel like his writing was not as good as the first and second book because he was just trying to hurry up and appease fans. So all in all, I'm going to give that one I'll say a solid B. Moving on, I've got the Fablehaven series. And if you guys don't know Fablehaven, it's because it's like a middle grade, early teens series. And because of that, a lot of people may not have read it or heard about it. But funny enough, this is also a series I re-listened to when I was working as a mailman, and it stands its ground. I had fun going back and revisiting the world, seeing the characters again. I just thought it was a really well done book, and it even held up me going back as an adult to read this. So I'm going to give that an A as well. Now, I don't think that an adult that has adult taste would read this book series and give it an A. I'm not saying that. I'm saying as someone who read this as a kid and gets nostalgic about it, it still holds its ground. Its writing is good. Its character's good. Its plot development is awesome. So I am going to put that as an A for me personally. All right, we have officially gotten to the Game of Thrones, one of the most popular fantasy series out there right now, and I would say of all time. I don't know if we're ever going to be able to read the ending of this series, but from what has been written, it, in my mind, is undoubtedly in the S tier. I know George R. R. Martin hasn't been able to finish his last 2 books, but even just how it is, even with me being a stickler for needing to read a book series from front to start, it stands its ground, and it is undoubtedly, in my opinion, an S. Getting to Lord of the Rings, I know some people don't even talk about this series. They just throw it in the S tier. But I do want to talk about it because I feel like depending on taste, this could make it down to somebody's A tier list because this is classic fantasy. Its prose is not modern fantasy. It does not read as easily as books nowadays do. So depending on taste, somebody might think this is an A. Some people might even feel like it's a B. Anything below that, I would have to say, no, you're wrong. I do see how individuals' taste for prose and writing could make this go down on the list. It's still an S tier for me, and it's above Game of Thrones for me. Like it is one of the best fantasy series I've ever read. I included The Hobbit in there too. And if The Hobbit isn't on your S tier, that's a way simpler prose, a way simpler way of writing. It's a way simpler writing style. So if you don't like that, that is something we would have to disagree on. Because I think The Hobbit is undeniably an S tier fantasy story. But Lord of the Rings, for taste, it could differ. But for me, it's going to be right near the top of S tier, if not the very top of my S tier. Patrick Rothfuss, Kingkiller Chronicles. This is another story that may never be finished. I'm just kidding. I'm sure he will eventually finish it. But this is another book whose prose is just beautiful. His writing style is really unique. I know people have a problem with the protagonist being the infallible hero. And that's one of my least favorite tropes of all time is the hero that can do no wrong. All the women love him. He's good at anything he tries automatically. But for me, even the worst tropes done correctly can be made into the best stories. I think the Kingkiller Chronicles falls into this category of taking one of the worst tropes out there and just making it into a beautiful work of art. So I'm putting Kingkiller Chronicles into the S tier for now. This could change as I become better read in fantasy, but I think he did a really good job. The Percy Jackson series is a series that I read probably in middle school. Now that I'm thinking about it, I am missing some books from this. I'm missing 11 Thumps, A Series of Unfortunate Events. It's The Fire Within, which is a book series about. They make it sound like it's about dragons, but it's actually about squirrels and polar bears. It was good. It was just disappointing for not being about dragons when there's a dragon on the cover. Anyways, Percy Jackson was a great book series. I remember really liking it. If I could remember, I think I'd be putting it in A or B, but I can't remember the prose, the stories, the characters well enough to accurately judge this. So it's going to have to go down into the I can't remember category again. I do remember reading it and thinking I knew everything about Greek mythology, though. And I think some of you guys were probably in that category as well. The next book series is also one I don't know is considered science fiction now that I'm really thinking about it. This might just be considered a mystery detective novel. I'm going to have to look up the difference, like the actual definition of science fiction. This definitely isn't fantasy, though. It's set in the real world. Its stories involve a little bit too much science and stretching of the imagination to be actually possible to me. So that's why I included it into the science fiction category. I'm going to give this one a high B because even though I loved each one of these stories, I don't know if they're books that I would go back and read and enjoy. They were just really good novels that I had fun reading at the time. All right, the next series on the list is going to be The Right Area Revelations. And this was a book series that I knew nothing going into. It was also a Audible read, and I think I got 2 for 1. I think I got it on a 2 for 1 credit deal. So this was a pleasant surprise. The characters were the best part of this entire series. The character development and their relationship was awesome. It was beautiful. I'm going to put this as a B. It's I might score it below Aragon just for sentimental reasons, but below the Inheritance Cycle just for sentimental. But no, Theft of Swords is objectively the better book. It might be better than the Pendergast series too. So I'm gonna put it as a high B then. And I think it has to do with the relationship between the two characters. It was beautifully done. The story was awesome, and it had an epic. Its fight scenes were epic. So all in all, it was really well done. I just don't think it made that cut into the A category. Okay, so the next series is a classic. It's the Harry Potter series. And considering the only book to rival the sales of this is the Bible, that's something pretty impressive. Even though it's not the start of the young adult subgenre of fantasy, it's what popularized the young adult genre. I think we owe a lot of that to Harry Potter. But forget the influence it's had on the genre or to our society today. Just the books, just the stories, I thought are so magically done. Yes, there are discrepancies between the books. Yes, there are things that don't make sense, but I think part of the fun of Harry Potter is it's a soft magic system that doesn't always need to make sense. It's this magical, whimsical world that is supposed to not make sense to us. So I am putting Harry Potter almost to the top of the list. Like, Harry Potter holds such a special place in my heart. So moving on, we're going to talk about The Once and Future King, which is, in my opinion, the oldest Arthurian story you can go to that isn't boring. Like, you can read the what's it called, Le Morte d'Arthur, but I don't think that's a good read. It wasn't like I read a couple pages of it and was bored out of my mind. The Once and Future King is whimsical. It's so well written. It's a writing like unlike any others out there. The first book in this series is The Sword and the Stone, which obviously was adapted to a Disney movie, and it's a great story. I'm going to put this as the highest A, I think. This is another story that, like Lord of the Rings, if you do not like the classic fantasy prose, if you don't like that kind of storytelling, it might be way down there on the list, in the C category, because it does have a prose that isn't for everyone. And there's parts of the story in the middle that are just boring. You want to hurry past them, but something I learned is that not every part of the story has to draw your attention deeply in. Sometimes boring parts of a book are important and can make the exciting parts mean that much more. So, The Once and Future King, it's a collection of stories I think deserves a high, high A. Moving on, we have the First Law trilogy by Joe Abercrombie, and it is one of the most popular series out there. Is literally getting so many people involved and interested in grimdark fantasy, and in my opinion, has some of the most well-written characters of all time. Glocta is literally one of the deepest characters I've ever read. So all in all, I will have to put this right above Name of the Wind, I think. A little bit less than Game of Thrones, but definitely better than Name of the Wind, in my opinion. Mostly for personal taste, though. So on my series is Twilight. And funny enough about this is that my mom actually forced me to read this because she thought it was such a good book, a great series. I fought her on it tooth and nail, and I ended up really liking it. Even with it having one of the worst tropes, the only thing worse than the infallible hero is love at first sight. I mean, infallible hero is pretty bad, but love at first sight is right up there. If it's not just as bad, it's right underneath. So it has one of the worst tropes in it of all time, and some of the worst characters. I don't know anyone who likes Bella. I don't know anyone who likes Edward. So the fact that she was able to write such a popular book with such a horrible trope and horrible characters shows her skill as a writer and as a storyteller. So I actually think that this book goes right underneath the Once and Future King. It's definitely an A series for me. Personal preference again, and we'll see how my tastes change. But I thought she did a wonderful job writing it, and she goes to show that even terrible tropes can be made into great stories. Brandon Sanderson's, I put the Cosmere in here. I'm not going to split it up into like the Stormlight of Archives, Mistborn, Elantris. I'm just including this I'm including this as the Cosmere itself. And you are about to learn that I am a huge Brandon Sanderson fan. I think he's the greatest. I think he is the GOAT. I think he's the greatest author of all time. And if he's not yet considered the greatest author of all time, it's not long till he is. So I'm putting him up there above. I'm putting him and the Cosmere up there ahead of the Lord of the Rings. I think his storytelling method is beautiful. I think that the way he links universes, or I think the way he links all these different stories into one big main story told over different times and space, it's an amazing thing, and I think he's going to go down as one of the greatest authors of all time. Last on the list is The Witcher. This is a series that when I started, I thought this was going to be, if not the greatest thing of all time, up there. So I finished the first and second books, and it is the only series on this list that I haven't finished to completion. Because I got done with the second book, loved it, and I got the third book, got halfway through, couldn't finish it. I set it down, school got in the way, and when I picked it up, I had to reread it from the start. Got to that third book again, couldn't finish it. I have not been able to push through that slump. So whereas I think that the first two books are in the AS category, the fact that I think I've tried to start this 3 or 4 times, or I think I've tried to finish that third book 3 or 4 times, and I need to push through, but the fact that I haven't been able to, it worries me a little bit. So since I haven't been able to finish the story, I'm going to put this as a B, and I'm going to put this underneath Theft of Swords, because I haven't been able to finish it. I think this has a potential to be up in that A category, maybe low S, but the fact I won't know. I won't be able to accurately give you that assessment until I finish the series. So that is every fantasy series I have ever read, and it is looking pretty sparse. I thought I was better read in fantasy before making this list. I have some reading to do. I think my progress from the start of this year to the end of this year is going to bring me from a novice in fantasy to becoming better read in fantasy. I think it's going to be a long journey, but I'm excited that I have this starting point cataloged and journaled and here for us to look back on so that we could see how I change over time. With that being said, thank you for joining me. Like I said, I think this is going to be either my first or second video, and I'm excited to get started and happy you guys watched. Thank you for your time.